Hi, everybody. Look at where I get to be with these people. I'm pretty thrilled. Are you having a good time so far? Good, I am too. I am so grateful for these panelists. I won't go into details, but there is some sacrifice on this stage for these folks to be with us today. And I know we have so much to learn from them. And it's such a rare delight for us to be able to actually be hearing from our community of service, which are the leaders of our nonprofits in our sector. So we're really, really grateful to you guys. And just so you know, before I do introductions, we are not structured for this panel to have questions from you guys at the end. If we have some extra time, we'll take one or two, but just so you know, that's not been built into this. So we'll see, but there may be time. So, all right, I am now going to introduce our illustrious guest. So to my direct right is Alyssa Santino, Executive Director of Programs and Operations at the Joseph Drown Foundation. And Alyssa is the primary resource for their grantees. And so she has a wonderful sort of overview of nonprofits and what their needs are at this moment. So thank you so much for being here. To my extreme left is Adrienne Lamar Snyder, CEO of Riverside Area Rape Crisis Center. And just so you know, ESC has a relationship with Adrienne and her organization, and some of the ESC consultants who have worked at Riverside Area Rape Crisis Center include Asbjorn Milo, Jaylee Brawley, Michael Linsk, Stephen Gutwillig, Alma Johnson Hawkins, and Natalie Baudin. So if I left anybody out, say, hey, what about me? Great. And to my extreme right, Deborah Suh, who is currently a board member at the Asian Pacific Institute, but is the former ED of the Center for the Pacific Asian Family. And a lot of Deborah's insights and what she'll be sharing with us today is going to be kind of based on that experience. And that's how we know you. So Deborah, was it 3 times you attended the Van Nuys Charities custom cohort? And most recently, Deborah was a guest speaker at the Executive Directors Leadership Institute. Thank you very much for doing that. So our relationship continues. And then finally, Norema Cabot, one of my favorite people. She is the CEO of a place called Home. I think it says Executive Director in your programs. Forgive our mistake. Her title is CEO. And she is the former Executive Director of Los Angeles Center for Law and Justice. And we've gotten to work, ESC has gotten to work with Norema in both of those, in both of your, yes, and it's been fabulous. And some of the consultants who've worked with Norema in both organizations are Jorge Siopak, Harris Sperling, Linda Camaras, Susan Nero, Susan Leonard, Prakash Sakrani, and Bernice Kahn. Yay! Okay, so I've introduced the panelists to you, and now I kind of want to introduce you to them really briefly. So you're seeing probably what represents about half of our core. So that gives you a sense of the size of the core that is Executive Service Corps. So just by way of introduction and by a show of hands, who here has under 2 years or less service as an ESC consultant? Fantastic, thank you. How about 2 to 5 years of service as a consultant? Great. 5 to 10 years? 10 to 20 years? Over 20 years? Oh my God, Fred and so that gives you a sense of the kind of commitment that these amazing people have to you amazing people and the work that you do. So together we are better. Okay, so let's get started. So just to kind of, what are we doing here? Why are we here? We're really here to talk about the disruptions to our sector of the last several years. We've seen so many rapid changes, so many far-reaching changes and challenges. So just a couple of bullet points on my card: global pandemic, new hybrid work environments, the widespread turnover of leadership and staff, the largest racial reckoning in US history, all of these have had such an impact on the work that we're doing. And we've experienced that impact at ESC. We've had some staff turnover leading to a reorg. We're now pretty much hybrid all the way. And a lot of our consulting is now being done, as you guys are experiencing, and in some cases virtually. So that's kind of, you know, where we are. Could you each, in 1 minute, kind of situate us where your organization is, or your organization was, and the organizations you're seeing, Alyssa, in relationship to all of these changes that we've been seeing? And let's just go down the line. Deborah, would you start? Sure.
So, as Julia was saying, I was an executive director at the Center for the Pacific Asian Family for the last 23 years. I just rolled off beginning of October. And one of the things that we definitely saw during the pandemic is a really shift in like the needs of our staff, and the HR needs were really different. And nothing new, you're seeing it there. Transition, and of course, my transition. But one of the things that after 23 years, we went through a lot of different types of pivots. Like I know 2008 pivot was pretty significant when, you know, the economic recession happened and we had to shift how we do our work then. There were different shifts that I had to make along the way, but one of the challenges that came out during the pandemic is the shift in how do you create culture in your organization when you don't have the water cooler talks, when you're not seeing each other every day to talk about what challenges you're seeing. And one of the things I had to kind of face up is I'm an immigrant to technology, and I am not as comfortable creating culture using technological means. And that was an area that I had to really learn if I wanted to stay. And I felt like it was something that I thought someone else may tackle it, younger might tackle it better. And so I decided to transition out. There are a lot of other things as well, but that's one of the key things. And also really feeling like we were at a great place to bring on a new leader.
Thank you.
Thank you. So as Julia mentioned, I'm the executive director at the Joseph Brown Foundation. And okay, I'll hold it closer to my mouth as I was saying we needed to do earlier.
That's like, you're on mute, you're on mute.
Exactly. And I don't have an overly loud voice, so we'll hold it much closer. And so we see a wide range of nonprofits who do apply to us and have a lot of these conversations. Starting in the pandemic, I think what the nonprofit sector really did so well was we know how to do call to action. We knew emergency response, we all need to pivot. We all understood we need to work together, find new ways to collaborate, and that was great. And now we're at the point where we need the time and space to really figure out, well, now what? What's the new normal? What's next? And figuring out how to find the moments of support. Where do we need extra support to do longer term thinking? And the relationship building, I think, is huge. What does that look like in the digital space? How do we create meaningful relationships as we see turnover? We went through a leadership change. I'm the result of that back in April. We see many of our nonprofit partners having leadership change. And there's a whole host of items and strategic planning that goes around that effective planning. And I don't think we've had the time or energy or capacity to focus on how to do that effectively. And it's one of the reasons we support ESC's work and appreciate all of you so much, because I think we need to be thinking of other places we can get support from to be able to do that and push the nonprofit sector into this next new normal, I guess is what we're calling it, right?
Thank you. You can hold on to that. I'll go to Norema.
So Julia just reminded me that I actually transitioned right in the middle of this whole craziness from one organization to the next. So now I understand why I'm so tired all the time. But what was interesting was that my previous organization, I was there 6 months before March of 2020. What was interesting was that in that organization, we had a model that we thought could not be transitioned to virtual. Quickly, we figured out how we could. right? And so business models that we thought wouldn't translate that way, we were actually able to be very successful and found that it actually eliminated a lot of barriers to access for services. Now, with a place called Home coming in about a year after the start of the pandemic, in a very different place, still with some challenges. And what I find that there's a great opportunity to question the status quo, right? A lot of organizations, we're no different than that. We just celebrated 30 years last Thursday, but we fall into these predictable patterns of doing things the way we do them because we've always done them that way, right? And now it gives us an opportunity to really question and to say, why? Who made up that rule? Or why does that policy exist? Or how do we bring in additional resources and support that can help us look at what we're doing, why we're doing it, and do it in a different way? Our wonderful consultants just helped us complete our strategic plan. And I have to say, this is probably one of the best strategic plans that I've ever been a part of. And it is because we started from that framework, was really questioning who we are, what we do, why we're doing it, where we want to do it, and what is that going to look like in the next 2 years. So we decided to go through almost like a transition strategic plan, and that's going to really help us set ourselves up for this next phase of the organization, which we're going to move into a growth expansion potentially. But it wasn't until we were able to question all of these things and really solidify that base that now we're ready for this next phase of growth. So for me, it's actually really exciting.
Good afternoon. I'm Adrienne Lamar Snyder, as Julia introduced. I want to start by saying I appreciate this forum that you're presenting right now. I am the CEO of the Riverside Area Rape Crisis Center, and I've been the CEO for 5 years now. I just made a 5-year anniversary. But my background is Black women's health, violence prevention, and I ran a large shelter as the COO for a large domestic violence shelter in Los Angeles. I did that for about 14 years and happened to then meet a wonderful second husband and got married and moved to Riverside, and then thought, what the hell have I done? When I got to the organization where I worked in Los Angeles, I always approach my work, how to do shelter work without borders, without boundaries, because we know that victims and survivors, about 5% of them actually come to a shelter program. How do we reach the 95% who do not? Knowing that you have to go out and meet people where they are. Provide the prevention work, the intervention work, the education that's necessary to move people out of the vulnerability and the violence and to move them to stability, to thrive. When I got to Riverside at the Rape Crisis Center, I started right when they got there in 2018, and then the pandemic hit, the COVID pandemic. So I, again, approached that work as, how do we do this work without borders? Immediately, I walked around the organization and saw people sitting at their desks every single day, 8 to 5. I'm like, what are you doing? Why are you here when the work that we need to do is outside? Very conservative place. If you all know anything about Riverside, So again, then I'm trying to catch my bearings. And I knew that trying to turn this ship around was going to be very difficult. And I needed some help. And I called Janet at ESC and got connected to Julia. I don't know what the heck is going on. Why is it that my board and my team are not connecting to the mission? Well, if they can't connect to the mission, I am going to help them connect to the mission. And with that, connecting to the mission was being prepared to start this work and do this work without borders. Immediately, the team would come in. I think they were operating off a desk Windows 7. And like Deborah, I'm no technology guru because I'm a woman of a certain age, but damn it, I know Windows 7 did not work. And so I immediately brought laptop computers. You have to get out in the field. We have to do this. We have to be prepared to meet people. And it was very, very difficult to make that shift. And we're still making that shift. And I want to say again, thank you to ESC for being the partner in helping me work with the board and the team to understand a transition needs to take place. So I hope that answered your question. I have more to say. I have a lot more.
Good. We want to hear more. That's great. Okay, so we're talking about impacts. Let's start with impact on mission. And Narima, I'm gonna direct this to you, and then I want anyone else to add in. So, and you talked about doing your strategic plan and kind of doing the whole, who are we, what do we do? And you know, I just wonder, for all of us going through these changes, how they change perhaps our service population, how we work with our service population, and our relationships with our communities. And I wonder if you could speak to that.
Yeah, so, you know, it's interesting. If you happen to have a board that is reflective of the community, it's great. But the reality is, of all of the organizations that you work with, how many of you have seen that that's not the case? Majority, right? Majority. So I have to say, when we did this strategic plan, it was the first time we did a presentation for the board that showed the demographics and how the community had changed from years ago. And so I think really the staff understand it because they live it, right? They're there day in and day out. But if we talk about how the vision of an organization starts and then makes it through to the rest of the organization, the leadership, the staff, the benefactors, the kids, for us, it's our kids who benefit from the program, how that starts, it all starts with the board. And if the board has a disconnect from your service, from your population, from your community, doesn't matter how great of a strategic plan you have, you've already started with two hands tied behind your back. So I think the most important thing, and I think it was time well spent, was helping the board understand how the community was changing. We operate in South Central Los Angeles. When the organization started 30 years ago, it was a predominantly African-American community. Now it's predominantly Latino. We had an initiative to serve more African-American youth. The big question was, and I see Susan and Prakash back there, and it was like, okay, if that's our goal, what does that mean for our operations? Do we move? Do we expand? Do we bus? And what are all of those implications? And mind you, that initiative had been part of the organization's strategic goals for years. But the how we're going to achieve that was never there. And then the changing demographics wasn't there either, that understanding. So now they get that. Now we have part of our strategic goal that talks about if this, then that, right? And it sounds so simple, but it was something that I thought was really powerful, that our board now understands what the community looks like, right? Who we are serving. And yes, we do want to reach out to more African American youth, but now we have a more robust plan, and a plan that actually makes sense on how we're going to achieve that, rather than say, here's our goal with no specific information. The board understands how the community is changing, and they're a part of that. As a result, it's now trickling down throughout the organization, right? And so we're seeing it a lot more impactful that way.
Wow, that sounds incredibly successful.
So
far. Yeah, yeah.
if I can just add to what you're saying, Naima, that you have to stay connected to your mission and how important that is, and how we have to go back to basics. Especially when there is a high turnover and you're having new staff come in, that is so important to keep ensuring that everyone understands what your mission is. And I'll give you an example. After George Floyd, there were some staff who were hired that wanted so I worked for a Center for the Pacific Asian Family, where we work with survivors of domestic violence and sexual assault. And so we do a lot of crisis management, 24-hour hotline, emergency shelter, and transition work. And some of the staff who were hired after didn't want to work with law enforcement. They were saying, no, we have to defund them. We can't work with them. And we were saying, well, but that's part of our mission, is really empowering survivors and really helping them in their journey of healing. And if they want to go to law enforcement and report, then we need to support them. We need to be there and really give them agency as to what their healing and what their justice looks like. So we had to really talk to some of the staff who, one staff who didn't really align with that, and to ask, like, are you in the right bus? You have to really, we have this analogy of, you have to make sure that everyone in your bus is in the right bus, headed in the right direction. And then also, are you in the right seat? If you're in the right bus, but not the right seat, not the right position, we can kind of think about switching you over to other jobs. But if you're not in the right bus, this may not be the right organization for you, right?
Yeah, so Deborah, as we're looking at so much turnover, so much hiring happening now, how do you infuse that sense of mission and bringing the people on who are going to ride that bus with you?
Right, that's a great question. This is what we are feeling, that there is a lot of transition, is actually real. The April 2023 survey done by National Council of Nonprofits said 75% of nonprofits are experiencing vacancies, 75%. And so we are seeing a lot of transition. So how do we make sure people coming in are being really brought into the culture of the organization when we're not seeing each other face to face as much? How do we do that? I mean, we do have the formal orientation that is, making sure that they go through all of our organizational materials, like understanding our mission, vision, and history, values, and all of that, and meeting with each of the teams. So we do all that orientation, but that doesn't really stick as much as the continual cultural inculcation, so to speak. So we've had to create things like every Saturday morning, we have breakfast club where people can come in virtually, and once a month in person, where we are having breakfast. So the cooler talks has to be much more intentional and created. Like, it's kind of artificial initially, but people really enjoy coming and playing games, and it's kind of an hour to just connect informally and being able to really develop different strategies to create that space, to create culture and bring people in an informal way. There are a lot of other things that I can talk about, but we do actually bring people in. We force them to come back and eat with us, because food is a big part, was always a big part of how we connected. So we do have lunches and breakfasts together in different points.
Beautiful. let's move on to funding. So we're all very interested to understand more about how the funding climate has changed, has been impacted. And I'd love to start with you, Alyssa, and then I'd like to know how the rest of you have had to shift with those changes. But let's start with you.
So I think from the foundation perspective, what we really tried to do during the pandemic, and we're still in the process of doing, because I think it's an ongoing process, is taking a step back to reflect and listen more, refine our policies, make sure that everything we're doing is lessening the burden on our nonprofit partners instead of asking for more and more, especially when they're navigating through transitions, just like we're navigating through transitions. So that shifted to allow, and we've had the same thing with our board as well, like how do we take the board along for that transition of being more flexible, more open to operating support, understanding leadership and what transitions for strategic planning, like what that looks like. So it's not the most glamorous funding. When you're telling a story, they can grab onto a program that's affecting kids, but how do we say, we also need to invest in infrastructure? So figuring out how to take our board along on that journey and being open to changing how we do things in response to what we're hearing from our nonprofit partners. So that's been a huge shift on our side. I felt like a lot of foundations, when it was emergency response, were open to doing operating support and now have kind of shifted back to program again. And so we're also trying to find ways how to connect with other foundations and have those conversations so that we don't do that, that we continue to be responsive and forward thinking instead of just reverting back to the structures that we've always had in place. So that shifted a lot. I think what the support that nonprofits need from boards has shifted, what they're asking of their board members and how they need them to engage is very different. So we're thinking through that too. Can we be partners in recruiting people who are aligned to mission in different ways, who do have the resources to come along on that journey with nonprofits? So thinking through not just dollars, but what other ways can we help our nonprofit partners find that connective tissue? So I think thinking of the whole landscape more holistically has shifted instead of just, here's an application, here's a grant. What's really going to shift the landscape forward and support the long-term sustainability of nonprofits? Because I think we've seen they step up to the plate when we need them the most, and they're such an important sector. So how do we continue to make that the most robust it can be?
Thank you. When you make the effort to listen to partners more, to hear what they're needing, what are you hearing?
We're hearing a lot of burnout. We're hearing the need for more of a trust-based philanthropy approach where when is it right to ask for more metrics and more information, and when do we need to step back and allow them to do the work because they're the experts on the community where they're serving. It's not us. So being open to learning what that looks like and what the needs are. And so that's been really valuable. They've said that's been really helpful in their strategic planning, that we're just open to flexibility of how we do it. We don't have to do it, like you were saying, the same way we've always done it. The sky's the limit. We could change anything we want to. There's no reason it has to exist in the same space. So that's been huge, is just being open to having those conversations and shifting as needs arise.
Thank you. Anything else anyone would add about how you've had to adapt to shift it to changes in funding?
Well, one thing that I would like to add is that we're looking, and I think coming into a place called home, I brought a bit of this into the organization, and that was really looking and trying to quantify our impact, right? Because if we're asking others to make an investment in the work that we're doing, then how do we show we're actually creating that impact, right? So not being afraid to quantify the cost for that output, right? For that impact. And so one of the things that's part of our strategic plan is really establishing a cost per child and being able to say to funders, for every dollar you invest, here's the ROI that we're able to produce. And it sounds scary for nonprofits to go into that direction, But in every other sense, we really are a business. Our business is of service, right? And so if we're asking funders, we're asking donors, we're asking supporters to make an investment in the work that we're doing, we do have to be able to show what that impact looks like. And so that's something that we're really moving towards. And then also ensuring that we are building into our structures ways of creating that sustainability so that we're not having to chase every dollar all the time, right? So what are some lines of business that we could bring into the organization that could help support and grow in a way that makes sense for the organization? So looking at funding structures, funding ratios, and all of those things that that really make a difference, right? We can completely depend on public funds and private funds all the time. We really have to look at creating systems that would be self-sustaining for an organization. And that's something that we're really looking at moving forward. So
Thank you. You can't hear me at all? Can I hold it? Sure. Is that better? Do you want me to, why don't I just use this? Why don't I just, sorry. Going really well. Thanks. Okay, is that better? All right, we'll just keep passing it around. Okay, so thank you for mentioning the 75% of organizations who have vacancies right now. And in terms of leadership in nonprofits, so I'm going to just read something I read recently. Korn Ferry reports that in the first 6 months of 2022, 174 nonprofit and government sector CEOs resigned, which was a 39% jump from the same period in 2021. And at the time, they were predicting that this is only going to go up. And I've heard crazy statistics, as much as 75% turnover in the next 5 years. So, Deborah, as a leader who was in that position for a very long time and then left, what's your take on this great ED resignation, CEO resignation?
I think it's a great opportunity for nonprofits to retool themselves, to pivot and go in the direction that, you know, will really help them flourish in the next 5 to 10 years. Because really, while I was at CPAF, I did try to innovate, but it was still me. And I'm sure I have my blinders, and there are certain, and I may be strong in certain areas, but not others. So when I thought about leaving CPAF, I let the board know, and it was actually a very long process. It was a almost 3-year process. And one of the things we wanted to make sure we did was to have a mini strategic plan where we talk about, this is a moment where we can pivot. And so you know what kind of ED you want to recruit. Let's talk about where you see CPAF in 5 years, 10 years, so that we can bring in the right person who can take us there. So that was one of the things that really allows an organization that had a founder or a longtime ED who had been taking the organization in one direction to really allow them to reimagine what, you know, the organization would look like. I think it's a great opportunity. But I think one thing I remember thinking is we should have been doing this all along in terms of succession planning all along. And what my recommendation to the board was, when you hire a new ED, start with them after their first year to come up with their succession plan. And that's something we had started doing at the beginning of pandemic for all of our positions. We started talking about what would succession look like for each of the leadership position, from like managers to directors, everyone, to think about how they can be succeeded. So that's something I think we should be changing as a sector, to really build in for EDs to start thinking about their succession planning as they're hired. And one of the ways to make sure that our timeline, our personal timeline doesn't impact the timeline of the organization, is to provide them with an exit package, so that they can say, well, you don't have to worry about going into your next job while you are transitioning, and really match the time of the transition to your personal needs, right? To avoid that, give them an exit package so that, and a lot of them are actually coming into the ED position negotiating an exit package. So they know when they are leaving, they won't have to worry about it. So the timeline is really built around what is best for the organization and what is needed at that time.
That is fascinating, and music to my ears to hear you talk about the need for succession. And I made eye contact with John Krakowski out there because we've talked about this a lot, and we're working on a service now that's really succession management. So to be working at all times on what's going to be needed, and so John's been a great partner in that. I'm going to direct this to you, but I am quoting you, Deborah. So recently when Deborah spoke at our Edley Institute, she said, and tell me if I'm misquoting you, there's never been a more difficult time to be an ED. And I wonder what your takes are on that.
Oh, Deborah, great quote. I want to underscore what Deborah has said about succession planning. When I started as the CEO of the Riverside Area Rape Crisis Center, they hadn't done succession planning for more than 15 years. Oh, I heard a gaffe back there. What was that? Yeah. And so I think, and then we had board members who bylaws had not been updated, board members who had been on board without breaks for 12 years, 20 years. And so that is no way to run an organization effectively. And so when they got me, probably not through strategic planning, surprise, I knew that's what we needed to do. And it is difficult right now to maneuver in such a cultural change, such a conservative area when you're dealing with humanity and human rights and racial justice and equity, with aligning the board with a mission that incorporates all of that work, how difficult it is to maneuver those changes and maneuver that cultural change. So it does, it can appear to put EDs or CEOs at odds with your board of directors. They need a great deal of support when that may appear to be the case. So it was just it has been very difficult, and just to understand that there is still a transition that is happening when you have all of those dynamics that are existing in the same place, when you also have a reckoning with what's happening. There's a humanitarian crisis going on right now, and we are just a microcosm of all of those issues that exist in the community as well.
Great quote, and I agree 100%. And I think we all succeeded previous executive directors or CEOs that had served for a long time. And I think it's interesting because coming into an organization, they want change, but not too much. Make it better, but don't disrupt it, right? This needs to change, but don't make people upset. And so it's, I find myself playing like double dutch, trying to figure out what's too much, what's not enough, what's too little, what's, and so kind of playing and really figuring out that line is a very, very interesting time. What I will say is that one of the, I'm going to say this, one of the smartest things I did coming into a place called home, and what I negotiated as part of my contract coming in, was that the board chair had to stay in his position for 2 years with me. And that has made the biggest difference. So if I could give a piece of advice to a new incoming CEO or executive director, is whoever hires you as the chair, ask them to stay with you for 2 to 3 years. Because if you are managing that change, if you're managing those transitions, those, things that come up in your first 2 years, you want the person who shared that vision with you to stay on with you for that time. And the board chair can be the biggest champion of that change, or those, whatever is happening in an organization. I'm working on him for another 2 years because he reminded me he has 1 more year left with me. But, we're trying to negotiate another 2. But I will say that has been such a huge benefit, because he's the person I have the most contact with, right? I meet with him on a biweekly basis. We're talking about not just what's happening, but we're talking about the board, we're talking about initiatives, we're talking about strategy, all of these different things. And he really helps to champion the board in a way that I can't do. And so that has been a huge benefit to have. The role of a CEO and executive director, I think, is a challenging one anyway. But yes, I think in these last couple of years since the pandemic, we've really seen a lot of different things that now impact our role, right? We have a workforce that somebody just recently said to me, this is one of the most sensitive workforces I've ever seen or have experienced. And yes, in many ways, there is a level of sensitivity that comes. And I think one, it's a cultural gap. There might be a generational gap. There's a lot of different factors that impact, and we're finding ourselves having to have conversations that have never happened before, right? We just went through a restorative practices certification for the organization that talks about trauma-informed care, right brain practices to help people understand we're not all perfect, we make mistakes, but can we restore and repair relationships? If I've offended you, can we restore and repair relationships so that the work can continue and move forward? I've been in nonprofits over 20 years. I've never had to have those kinds of conversations, but now we're having to build these systems in the organization to ensure that there's opportunity to have those kinds of conversations and be able to still move the work forward.
Really helpful. Thank you. I'm going to swivel to you, Alyssa, because I want to talk about boards. And you mentioned earlier that you were hearing that nonprofits are needing some different, they have different needs from their boards. Can you talk a little more about that?
Yeah, so I think I'm hearing from a lot of nonprofit partners that they need their boards to come along on a bigger part of the journey. They need them to be more engaged, not just show up to the board meeting, not just fill a spot, fill a gap that we need to fill on the board, but really engage in more meaningful ways and really activate their expertise in new and different ways than maybe they did before. I think it was, you want to have a lawyer on there, you want to have someone who understands fundraising, but instead of that, it's, can you be a strategic partner? Can you come along with us while we reset our mission? We see a lot of nonprofits resetting their missions right now. Does our mission really reflect the work that we're doing now? Does it reflect, as we see shifts in communities, does it reflect the community that we're now serving? And asking the board to dig in a little bit deeper. So the challenge has been finding people who, one, have the expertise to be able to do that effectively, two, have the capacity, because that's asking more time of a board when they're not getting paid. Obviously, it's an act of service, but making sure that there's a balance in system efficiency so that they can show up and put in enough hours that it's effective, but not so many hours that then a board member is having burnout as well. So I think we're seeing a lot of turnover in boards because that new engagement is really needed, which is a place where I think volunteers can really fill in some of those gaps as well. But we're seeing they just need a little deeper engagement from boards because it is the hardest time to be an executive director, and extra support is just really needed to have those difficult conversations.
Great, thank you.
Yeah.
So, we're hearing a lot about churn, about burnout, about vacant positions that have to be filled. And I guess the hope is that we'll get through this and we'll be whole. My question to all four of you is, what changes have resulted from what's been going on in the environment? What changes do you think are permanent? When we talk about the new normal, what are we looking at that might be permanent differences that our consultants need to know about as they're going into organizations like this is new now and it's going to be this way? We start with you. Yeah.
So
great.
what I will say, I think the hybrid is here to stay. I think that's a new normal that we're going to experience. So no matter what kind of business you have, we have a direct service model, and still we have a hybrid where staff work their mornings at home and then come into the afternoon. The other thing, and I shared this earlier, is that and I may be unique to this, but I am trying to help our staff understand that the reality of having individuals that serve their entire career in one nonprofit is probably not going to happen anymore. People are going to transition out of positions more than they ever have before. And I think what my approach is that we welcome them and we give them the experiences as much as we can offer, and then they're going to transition to a different role, and we will wish them best and welcome the next new person. I think it gives nonprofits an opportunity to bring in new perspectives, but I still have some staff that have a hard time with, we can't lose this person because they know everything. Well, then what does that say about us, right? That goes to succession planning and how do we build structures in place so that we're not panicking when someone leaves. But I think those are some of the things that we're experiencing.
Gosh, I just want to affirm everything that you just said. The hybrid model is here to stay. I think one thing that we need to look at as well is that the level of violence that we have seen in our communities is really just off the charts. And when you have a frontline team who is expected to deal with trauma 24/7, it is difficult for them to stay engaged and to deal with that secondary trauma and tertiary trauma. It's very hard. And so I really transitioned the organization as well to be a training organization. We want people to come in, learn, get their hours. We have practicum students who are MFTs, who are doctor level students who are getting their hours. I have a clinical supervisor on staff, and we have advocates. We are expanding a case management model that the organization never had before. Expanding our work to really address some of the root causes of violence, to address the determinants of health. This RARCC never did this before. And so as we look at funding and what's being required of agencies, they are looking for coalition building. They are looking for community engagement. This is something that our frontline team members have just not been used to doing before, and how we make greater impact. So I want this to be a training opportunity. And yes, we want them to come in, learn what they need to learn, and then go out and save the world. Leave the legacy. Let's continue to unite where we are, But no, I don't want you to stay at this agency for 15 years doing this work. Don't do that. I don't plan to do that. Look, succession planning is very important. So those things are there. And I think the other thing that we did not talk about, it's DEI. How do we plan to look as an agency for the duration? This is not just a one-off of diversity, equity, and inclusion. What do we need to do as an organization to make sure our policies make sense, our policies are inclusive? The work that we do is inclusive. That I shared with Julia, we had one board member to come on. She identifies as a lesbian, but 3 board members left because she identifies as a lesbian. So those things, not shocking. It's Riverside, okay? I'm just, not to give Riverside a bad rap. I'm not doing that. I actually enjoy going to the Mission Inn for Christmas. The lights up. But those are the things that we really have to make sure we are committed to doing, committed to the DEI work, committed to healthy transition, that it's not drudgery. You know, when somebody gives me a resignation because they don't like that I held them accountable for getting a report done, I wish you the best. It is the happiest day. Sometimes it's the happiest moment that I have during the week is to get a resignation for the person that needs to give their resignation. But I just want to be clear that this is a transition for us, and we're all going through the transition to meet the greater needs of the community and to engage on a large scale and make an impact addressing some of the root causes of violence that we see in our communities.
Thank you so much for, it's really important, I think, for us to hear about the escalation in violence in the communities that your organization center, and that the transition that you're talking about, the DEI efforts that so many of our organizations and ours as well are engaged in are not one-offs. That this is a new way of being, a new way of seeing. That's going to be, it's going to take a while. So on that note, when you all think about working with consultants whose lived experience could potentially be different from those of your staffs, those of your community of service, what does allyship look like to you?
So I think what we're talking about is equity. We're talking about how do we make our organizations more equitable, and that can show up in very different ways. And so one of the things we had to think deeply about how equity showed up to us was in how we compensate our staff. And so, you know, definitely salary is number one in challenges to retention and recruitment. But in addition to the actual salary, is really HR policies that may be disproportionately impacting people, right? So for us, we have a lot of women working for a gender violence organization, but when we looked at our maternity leave policy, we weren't giving them anything additional. So what we had to do is really think equity in creative ways and say, we will pay whatever the state SDI doesn't give you. So you don't have to use your sick time, because men don't have to do that. We wanted to bring you up to your full wage for the duration that you are out on maternity leave, so that your maternity leave doesn't impact your work. So we had to do some creative things like that to make sure that we're looking at how our HR policies are impacting our employees differently if they're women or men. So things like that. So I think that you can partner up regardless of your background and kind of looking at what are some policies, HR policies or other policies that are disproportionately impacting a gender or a racial community or and in other ways like age. There are a lot of different ways that we discriminate, or we don't mean to discriminate, but have disproportionate impact. So we can be very creative in looking at all of our different policies.
Great, thank you. Anything to add about allyship and how our consultants can interact with communities that are different than those they may have grown up in? Any thoughts about that?
For me, I think the number one thing is listening. Really just deep listening and engaging in someone else's experience and understanding what policies and procedures and what you're bringing to the table that might impede you from fully listening to someone else's experience, and really having the lens of how does this work affect the community or person that we want it to affect positively, and listening to that perspective with really open ears. That's kind of the number one. I always think allyship, I'm like, listen first is kind of the number one.
And if I can add, so our team came out and had lunch with me and they toured our campus. And I think a lot of times we're very quick to jump right into business because we want to be efficient and we want to get things done. But there's so much that can happen through relationship building of something that, that small. They came out, they toured, we had lunch, we sat and talked. And I think if you have an opportunity to do something like that with the team that you're going to be working with, visit the community that they're in, share a meal, something like that. It really does go a very long way. There's a connection that happens that can be very, very impactful. It builds trust and it really can make a big difference in the relationship between the consultants and the organization.
Great. Nice. What questions do the four of you have of one another?
I would love to know from the funder perspective, is there anything that you feel like funders are missing that they don't understand about what's happening on the ground where we could really be more effective partners in the work?
Yes. The funding priorities they shift. And sometimes we don't know that they've shifted.
100%.
Okay.
I feel the same. I used to know what other foundations are doing, and
Yeah.
I have no, I'm like, where's the communication about what we're all doing? Yeah, agree.
And you said listening was key,
Yeah.
and I think that is so powerful. For foundations to be open to listen to what's happening on the front line with organizations. And I want to give a quick shout out to the California Wellness Foundation. There was an LOI that we sent, and already knew that this may be a stretch, but because it was a well-written LOI, I'm sorry it didn't meet the funding criteria right now, but if you're open to a conversation, I would love to have that conversation with you. As opposed to assisting community-based agencies with some of the areas that they could look at. Are there ways to strengthen the work that they do? Are there ways to expand the work that they do? Are there collaborations that we may not be aware of? And I say that as a Board of Trustee member. I sit on the board of the Blue Shield of California Foundation board. And we are having those conversations about where we go with the economic downturn, with the limited funding that is now, that many foundations are experiencing. That has a direct impact on who we are as agencies. So being open to having those professional conversations with how we can be better at strategically being more attractive for funding in the future.
I agree 100%. And the other thing I would add is don't take the approach of penalizing nonprofits for having reserves. We experienced that, and I'll share this story. We were recipients of the Mackenzie Scott money, and I actually had other foundations who cut our funding because they specifically asked, what are you doing with that money? And so I think it's less and less, but if you want sustainable organizations, the only way that happens is when we build our reserves. So, right? And so I think it's a double-edged sword because you start to build that, but then you have some foundations that say, well, what are you doing with all that money? Well, that's not even 1 year of operating, right? And so it's good in one sense, but then we do see hits in others. And then I think, I love what you said about being able to focus more on general operating. And I think general operating's always been like a bad word in nonprofits and relationships with some foundations. But really understanding what does it mean, and without that type of support, organizations can't exist, right? The direct services don't exist without that general support. And so I think the more we can help foundations understand that in order to have an effective organization, in order for you to be able to show outcomes and impact and all of that, you do need that general support. Otherwise, we would have a bunch of kids running around playing all the time with no one paying the bills or anything else happening. And so that would be my.
Anything you would add, Deborah? Not to put you on the spot.
Gosh, I did want to mention that you mentioned, Julia, earlier that there's going to be a tsunami of transitions. And there are some foundations that are reluctant to fund organizations that will be going through transition. And I know that's shifting. And I think foundations listen to each other. And so in all of the things that we're mentioning, I feel like we're preaching to the choir right now, but can you and others who are like-minded influence each other to bring more of this conversation to those who are not at the table right now, right? So.
Thanks.
Thank you.
Any other questions that you have for one another? Don't worry, because I have plenty more for you. Great. Okay. So I'm gonna ask this last question, and then maybe our audience has some. But my final question, and I'd love all of you to answer this briefly if you can. When ESC consultants enter your organization or meet members of your community of service for the first time, what advice would you offer them? To the consultants, yes.
Okay, this is for you all. My advice would be to really understand the dynamics of and the landscape of where they are stepping into. The CEO is going to have a perspective. The board is really going to have a perspective, but take the time to really weigh it all. Because there are dynamics there that have been created that we may not be aware of. And it's important to really just lift that up and bring that to the surface. You may not be able to address whatever those issues are. We did have issues with, there were racial issues that were going on because our consultants came in right at a time when George Floyd's murder happened. And we had a board that was very non-responsive to, many of them were very non-responsive to what was happening. There were, I had several team members who were Asian team members. A lot of Asian hate was happening, and our board was very silent on that, and that was very hurtful for what was happening to some of the team members. January 6th happened. Our board was very silent on what happened around January 6th. And because we had a very diverse team, it was very hurtful. It was hurtful for me personally to not have a board to say that this is wrong. This is not our humanity. This is, we should be doing something to engage the community. There's nothing wrong with making these statements, but the statement that I did make was to come out, our board said, well, the statements made by the CEO just may not reflect, so those dynamics happen. But as Deborah said, all of these create opportunities for us to grow. It's with people who have limited information and limited experiences. And so it is not to vilify anyone for having the experiences that they bring to the table, but just being able to understand those dynamics are at play, and we have to work with those dynamics to bring people along. It is not about hate. It is really about connection and bringing people together. And those that will get it will work to get it. And those who don't want to, then as we said, I think liberation is great. There's always the door. So that's what I would say.
I don't have anything else. So understanding the unique dynamics happening within the organization. Any other advice, anyone? It's really happening this time.
What I would suggest is that you have a very clear understanding of what the organization wants to accomplish. We all say we want something different, right? Especially if you're doing strategic planning, we want something that's different and accountable and measurable and all of these things. And then we get into it and we might end up with the same thing that we've ended up before, right? And so I think what our team did that was really, really good, and Bernice was like on this, was how is this measurable? And how are you going to measure that? And what does that look like? Prakash, the same thing, Susan, the same thing. They were very good about helping us achieve that. And so I think, what does stretching the organization look like, and have an agreement on how you as a consultant are going to push them outside of their comfort to help them achieve something greater, so that there's that understanding, right? When you get stuck at the same thing you've been doing for a long time, the role of the consultant is going to be to push you beyond those comforts, right? And so what does that look like? And have an agreement at the beginning of what it's going to look like and what your role is going to be. I think that can lead to a very successful relationship between the organization and the consultant. But if you don't have that at the beginning, it can really come across as being pushy or like not understanding or those kinds of things. But if they're really trying to achieve something different, then something different has to happen. And your role really is going to be about pushing them beyond that comfort. So
That's great. Anything to add?
I would just say also find what speaks to you about the mission, the community, the people, because that makes digging into the work that much more impactful and meaningful for you as a human as well. So I think we all need to feel connected to the work to continue to dig in, because it is challenging sometimes. That's great. Deborah?
Yeah, and I think it was mentioned earlier that like you're going in and you're connecting with people, with individuals, to really have that human, a person-to-person connection is important, to have that lunch, to have that kind of time to decompress and really get to know each other. It is a good way to start, to see each other as people, not projects. And I think the most successful consulting experience we've had were when they were seeing us and hearing us fully and not coming in with an agenda of we need to accomplish this project.
How did you know you were being seen fully and heard fully?
I think that there was a deeper listening and a willingness to change from what we had originally talked about, what we thought we needed, to actually this may look a little bit different than what you were originally intending.
So flexibility.
Yes,
Yeah.
flexibility in adjusting scope, or kind of helping figure out, like, it sounds like you really don't have capacity to do what you really want. So how does that scaled back version look like for us?
Great.
And if I can just add one more thing, I think strategizing around potential pitfalls is going to be really important. I know we had a lot of sessions where, as a CEO, I met with the consultants about this might get a little sticky, or this might do this, and strategizing around those kinds of things so that it doesn't come up in like a big session with board members or staff members, and then you're having to manage that. But really kind of strategizing around those things can lead to a lot more successful sessions that you have, and moves the work forward. They were wonderful, and we did a board retreat. We did a leadership council retreat, and I asked them to lead things that I thought I couldn't push the board on, but as a consultant, they could. And so really strategizing around those kinds of things that I think led to a lot of successful outcomes.
And if I can just add one more thing, like specifically in strategic planning, the world has changed. Things are changing so rapidly. You can't have a 3 to 5 year plan anymore, because in 2 years, there might be another pandemic. So it's being able to help organizations have the tool set to kind of build their plane as they're flying it. So that's the kind of plan that we are looking for now.
Can you say just a little bit more of what that looks like to you?
Yeah, so the plan that we work on now it's kind of a strategic direction, and with some targets in mind, but it's flexible. So for example, if we're talking about how we want to make sure that domestic violence or sexual assault becomes much more talked about in our community, then that can be seen as, well, are we talking about in person, can be talked about virtually, it can be, the messaging can be very different based, so staying flexible and kind of showing like these are the tools, but you can kind of build it differently and fly it to different ways.
And when you have that kind of plan, Deborah, and please weigh in on this too, how do you, once that kind of flexible plan is built, how do you help your board do their governance of your implementation?
So some things are easier than others. Like if we're saying we want domestic violence, sexual assault to be more known in our immigrant APEC community, you can measure that by saying our hotline calls are going to go up 10% every year, or you can do measurable impact like that. When we are talking about we want to be build our infrastructure, you can kind of measure it in dollars. Like we want our IT investment to go up from like 3% to 5% of our budget, or you can do it in different ways, but infrastructure is big enough where when you want to go into technical investment, you can put that as what you want to do in the next year. And what we do is we yearly visit what does that next step look like. So we have the overall strategy of infrastructure, but next year we're going to invest in infrastructure of IT. The following year might be facilities. So you can kind of build out different milestones to measure, but it stays kind of flexible as the environment is changing.
Great, thanks.
So we created a dashboard for the board that shows where we are with our strategic plan. And one of the things that I started doing since I came on board was I provide the board with the written report a week before our board meeting. So they get the informational items a week before. At our board meeting, we're addressing a question. So it's something that they're going to be work on. They're not getting information, they're actually working on something. So now that we have our strategic plan, they'll get the strategic dashboard and they'll get an update in a written format a week before. And then the purpose of the meeting is now to address either resources, support, issues that have come up or where we're falling behind and how the board can actually help us move forward. What I have found is that when board members are working on things, they feel a lot more productive. They feel like they're actually contributing more than just writing a check, right? So our board meetings are not about exchanging information. They're about problem solving. We've done breakout rooms and we've done it through Zoom too. We've done them in person, but board meetings become about solving and advancing, moving things forward. Rather than just sitting there and hearing information. For me, I think, that's an update you can read on your own. I give it to you a week ahead. I answer any questions that they may have. We address things in committee, so they would have heard it in different areas, but the board meetings become actionable and become about solving and moving the strategic plan forward. So.
Well, I think that's a fantastic last word. We are at time. And let's thank our panel, if you will.